Well, first question you might think of when you look at a painting, who or what is the focal point of the painting? And that by focal point, I mean, what does your eye go to when you look at this painting? And someone says, yeah, Jesus, the guy right in the middle, right? And that is a good place to start when it comes to paintings. Not always, but generally speaking, there's usually a focal point. So that's a good place to start. And then you notice everything is kind of organized around him. And when you look at this painting, where do you see the most disorder or chaos? Someone says the bottom right. So yeah, very good. And I want you to really remember this because when it comes to the Black Death and the bubonic plague, the whole world will basically descend into the chaos that you see on the lower right, or the kind of a physical equivalent of this. So except for that lower right, generally when I look at this painting, I feel a sense of order and clarity, by which I mean, and I'm not, you don't need to be Christian or anything to get this and to interpret it this way. Jesus is sort of this stable anchor, like an anchor, like literally protected in his safe space, his bubble, protected, and maybe offering your protection for you, right? So we've gone from the shepherd metaphor to the sort of glorious Jesus inside his rainbow bubble, and it's really meant to visualize the last judgment, which is basically when you go to the pearly gates, or you are waiting at the entrance to heaven or wherever it is, and Jesus decides whether you go to heaven or hell. So that's a pretty big, major decision in your life, right? Probably the biggest, right, if you're a Christian. And so this is a very important story that needs to that Christianity is fundamental to Christianity, and I think it offers a very orderly, happy view of heaven. Everyone has a harp and a halo and a chair, and everyone's sitting down. And of course, if you don't go to heaven, you don't get any of that. So we'll look at in detail at some of the stuff on the lower right. I just want you to really think about this painting as again, the calm before the storm, and the storm that hits will be the bubonic plague, and it disrupts this whole worldview of clarity that you see in this painting here. So that's a good starting point. And now I want to talk about this idea of visualizing stories, and of course the tricky problem. So let me ask you guys, what do you think is one of the challenges when it comes to reading? Like, let's say you're reading the Lord of the Rings, right? And you're Peter Jackson and you want to visualize the Lord of the Rings in film. What are some of the tricky things when it comes to visualizing a story? What problems might come up? What might be something you have to consider? Yeah, and I'm sure enough of you have read a story and then seen the movie version of it to kind of appreciate that sometimes things get lost in translation, or sometimes it's not what you remember reading. It's different. So what kinds of things come up, do you guys think, or could come up? And it's okay if you don't know the answer. That's why we're here to talk about these questions. So one thing you might think about is, well, artists might take liberty, right? You might choose to paint one subject one way or the other. So there's no kind of perfect translation from the text to the painting, right? And as we'll see in a few weeks, many different artists might tackle the same subject and do so with their own bias or with their own preferences. So that's something definitely to keep in mind, that once artists start painting religious subject matter, you're kind of letting the genie out of the bottle. You're letting the cat out of the bag, because artists might start taking liberties with subject matter. So that might be in defiance of the religion patronizing the artist, right? So most of the paintings we're going to see for the next few weeks will be patronized by the church, paid for by the church. And so you have to be careful not to bite the hand that feeds you. But at the same time, you're definitely asking a lot if you expect artists to not pursue other sources of funding, like from private individuals, or to just take liberty with the subject matter. So that's something to keep in mind as we look at these pictures. And of course, depending on the artist, you're going to have varying degrees of liberty taken, or also you might think that once you start visualizing the story, you're kind of making choices that are neat, but also might limit you in terms of maybe someone interpreted it a different way. So keep in mind, it's not a one-to-one translation. Nevertheless, there's something very valuable about bringing a story to life in visual terms, particularly when you think about the fact that most people can't read. So remember that up until the Gutenberg invention of the printing press, most people, which you see here, most people really didn't have books at home. And if there were books, most of them were what were known as illuminated manuscripts. And this is true in Islam as well, where there's a very deep tradition of rewriting by hand the pages of the Quran. And in fact, I think in Islam, they were very wary about embracing the printing press, to the point that I think they didn't really, until the recent era, allow for printing the Quran the way the Bible was instantly embraced, or at least was embraced by Protestants, as a way to directly communicate with God. So it's really important in the next few weeks you're kind of going to be juggling a few balls. One of them is sort of the Bible, the other is paintings, and then of course the institution of the church, and then the kind of tendency to focus on subject matter that might not be religious subject matter anymore. So when it comes to the Bible, it's a matter of, well, the Bible is the word of God, or at least that's God's story. And so when you visualize the Bible, you're kind of honoring the stories, but you have to remember the church plays an important role because they're patronizing the artist. So of course you have to also elevate the church. And of course, once you do use the church as an intermediary between you and God and the Bible, perhaps, then suddenly you have this whole institution that emerges. And when we get to Protestantism, we'll see that the idea is that you should have a direct relationship to God and you don't need the church. So for now, we're just going to focus on visualizing the Bible for people who are illiterate and can't speak Latin or can't speak Greek, and basically wouldn't know the story unless someone told it to them. And it's a lot easier to have a painting that visualizes a story than to have the priest constantly repeat the story. So yeah, I think you can understand there's a real value to bringing these stories to life in painting form. Now, in this case, it's kind of a blend of text and painting, but still you're limited because once you're reading the story, it's kind of a one-on-one. It's very intimate. Opening a book means you are reading the book, but it's not as public as a work of art. So even though these are paintings in a book, there's something different about painting inside of a book versus painting large scale on a wall inside of a church. So speaking about the Bible, here is the text from Genesis. Genesis is the opening of the Bible, talking about the beginning of the world. As you can see, this is about Adam and Eve. And it says they realized they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. The Lord God, as he was walking in the garden, cool of the day, blah, blah, blah. You can read what it says here. It says, I was afraid because I was naked. So this is the biblical account. And so as an artist, you look at this and you say, well, how do I bring this to life in visual form? And no matter who you are, you're going to rearrange things. It's sort of like if you use this as a prompt for AI, the AI might spit out 20 different versions of how it digests this piece of text. So artists similarly are kind of like, the equivalent of AI back then. They're digesting this text and spitting out what they think is the proper way of visualizing the story. So as you saw, they sewed fig leaves together. The Lord God was walking. He basically sees them. He's like, hey, Adam, Eve, where are you guys? And they're hiding because they just made a big mistake. As you may know, God told them, don't eat of the knowledge of tree of good and evil. No, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or else bad things are going to happen. And human beings being human beings, we're like, oh, the forbidden fruit? Well, let me try that. And so Adam and Eve, it's a moment where they're very much ashamed of their behavior because they violated God. So do you think this picture here tells that story effectively? Is it visualize what we just saw clearly enough for people to be like, okay, that's what we just read? And someone says, yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. I think we could see what Adam and Eve look a little ashamed. They do seem a little, just the fact that of course, the serpent. Yes, sorry, thank you, Justin. And we'll, of course, get to that right now. And that's kind of the key thing I want to point at, that, where you put the serpent might alter the story to a degree, right? So the serpent is the one who, tricks Eve into convincing Adam to eat the apple. And this is the moment where it looks like God is confronting them, like, what did you do? And they're kind of hiding away, they're cowering, and they're literally have the fig leaf covering themselves up because now they're aware of shame, right? And that's the key idea here. So let me ask you a question. Why are Adam and Eve adults versus children? Why don't we see them as children? because they are literally God's children, right? And yet we don't ever see Adam, think of Adam and Eve as like a little boy and a little girl. And that's important because, well, they need to be adults. And I'll see if you guys can figure out why. No, more the biblical. Yeah, thank you, Carson. The biblical reason why, or kind of the logic behind needing them to be adults versus children versus literal, underage adults or underage people. Okay, good. I like that. I like that as a challenging question. So think about free will. So we all understand free will. You can either live in a world where all of your choices are predestined, and so you don't really have choice. So no matter what you do, it's the same fate. Or you live in a world where every moment is a choice, and it's up to you to decide what to do. So what's the difference between those two mindsets? Think about in terms of, do we children have free will, adults have free will, right? But what's the difference between an adult having free will and a child having? Do we hold adults to a different standard than we do children? Right, consequences. So Carson's, yes, adults, we have free will, but the difference is adults face consequences because we look at a child's choices as, well, they're not old enough to know right from wrong, right? I mean, maybe they are, but legally we hold this 18-year-old threshold as basically the line. When you cross that line, suddenly you go to jail if you break the law. Before then, you can't be held accountable because you don't know better, right? So if you had Adam and Eve as children, we would all look at them and say, wait, that's not fair. How can you punish a child for acting like a child, right? And we have the same rule for animals and, different things in different circumstances. But generally, we think of adults as you have free will and you pay the price, the consequences for your actions. So Adam and Eve have to be adults because otherwise we would not hold them accountable for their choice. So that's an interesting thing to think about. And of course, also this idea of visualizing shame in terms of nudity. And basically, the knowledge of good and evil here is focused on the idea of shame, and that before they eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they're not aware of their nudity. And once they do eat of it, they are aware that they're nude and they're very ashamed. And that's very important for understanding kind of the very important concepts in Christianity related to original sin, free will, and of course, why nudity is so tricky when it comes to Christianity. That's particularly because of the story of Adam and Eve. So going back now to the snake, you notice, where is the snake here? It's kind of down below. Eve is kind of like, she's kind of blaming the snake. She's like, but wait, the snake did, it was the snake's fault, right? I think that's kind of the impression I get, where she's pointing to the snake. God's like, what have you done? And Eve's like, but the snake, and the snake is like slinking away, kind of slithering away, like as you would expect, the bad guy in a story to be like, hey, I got them. And so I think this is kind of a very powerful moment where, yeah, he's blaming her for, yeah, Adam's either blaming himself or pointing to Eve. Yeah. And there's kind of a chain of blame where God's pointing at Adam, Adam's pointing to Eve, Eve's pointing to the snake, and the snake's like, ha, 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 ha. I got away with it. Right. And, we look at this, and yet remember, there's other ways of visualizing this story. So here you go. Here's another sort of moment. It looks like here, perhaps this is maybe before they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But, the artist in this case decided to portray this story a few minutes or maybe time that took place before the previous example. So here is like the peak moment of accusation and drama and tension and awkwardness versus here. So what's different here? Where in the story are we now in this case? Well, this is obviously them eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So we're kind of, in this case, obviously certain artists are focusing on different parts of the story, but you notice where you put the snake plays a big role. Like here, the snake is literally dividing one from the other, right? It's dividing Adam and Eve. He's kind of looking at Eve, and the snake is coiled around the tree. So, in this case, they're using the snake both as a sort of story subject, but also to visually divide one from the other. And I think the word for me here, the trees feel like they're recoiling. The snake feels like he's kind of recoiling away. So just that undulating shape of the snake, the sort of slithery shape, feels like you can almost feel the embarrassment or the awkwardness pervading the whole scene of the picture. So this artist does a really great job, I think, emotionally capturing that sense of anxiety and deflecting the blame away from things. Even the trees are kind of bending away. So I think that's a very powerful choice to visualize the story this way. And I just want you to remember that each artist might have their own way of telling the story. So for instance, I think this version, this picture is not as powerful as this moment. So, maybe depends on the moment the artist chooses, how they depict the moment, but there's a lot of options, a lot of variables, just like if you're prompting something for AI, and the result will be dependent on maybe how you prompt, right? Where in the story you want to show it. A good example, a good analogy is a movie poster. Movie posters often reduce the whole movie to one image, and that image might be the peak moment of tension, might be the moment of triumph. Another analogy might be a photographer telling the story of someone running a race, and you can either take the picture of them sitting at the starting block, or you can take a picture of them in their moment of triumph at the end of the race. But these are all choices that you have to make as an artist or as a photographer when it comes to visual storytelling. So I think you see that pretty clearly here. So what about here? Well, here we saw this the other day. I just want to show you how painting really has a whole nother level of emotion, but also a lot more choices you can make. And we'll go back to this painting later in the semester. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but you can see that here in context on the wall of the church, filling up the space, kind of filling up the void and fleshing out the story a little more. I think the painting gives you more of an option to really give you a connection to them emotionally than I think what you see on the left. So what about, well, the story of Last Judgment? Well, here's the Last Judgment. Son of Man comes in his glory, will sit on the glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Well, here is a visualization of that. And I think you could see there's definitely the sit on his throne. The nations are gathered before him, and but you don't see the sheeps on his right and the goats on the left. So here is an example of artists taking liberty with a story and perhaps focusing on one thing versus the other. I definitely see the glory in the terms of the golden backdrop. You feel the glorious kind of backdrop with God and Jesus in the middle, judging everyone. So it does faithfully visualize some elements of the story, but I think it's up to the artist to decide whether or not you have to be absolutely one-to-one with the story, or if you can take liberty, and maybe they have to consider whether or not they're going to upset the church or the patrons who patronize the artwork. So here's another example, and I think in this case, you maybe feel less of the glory, perhaps, but you notice here we've got a sense of the destination for those who don't live a good life, which is hell down below. So in this case, you don't necessarily see hell as prominently, but in this case, the artist really wanted to make sure that you see this kind of oozing blood leading down to the kind of beast, the serpent eating the dead or the damned. Now, I think if you want to follow I don't know if it's actually in the Bible, but certainly in Dante's Inferno, he has Judas being eaten by the devil. That's what you see in the Last Judgment here down below in the lower right. So as you can see, each artist takes their own liberty with the story, with obviously some of the key things intact in each of them, with Jesus in the middle as a focal point, Jesus in the middle as a focal point, Jesus in the middle as a focal point, but each artist has a different twist on the story. So it really is like prompting the same subject and getting different results depending on, almost like it's pulling a slot machine and getting different arrangements of figures. So let's go into detail and see a little bit. So here's Jesus inside of his rainbow bubble, no shoes, almost like a clock, like the hands of a clock, looking up and down, and obviously looking down at the people who are being judged, surrounded by angels. That's meant to, I think, show the glory. And here are the people waiting to go up to heaven. And as you can see, it's a cross section of society, a whole lot of different people. And so when you look at this, you're meant to think, okay, that I'm in that line of people, I'm waiting to be judged. And I think that's very powerful. If you really want to make that Last Judgment feel impactful and present and urgent, then yeah, you need to show people kind of waiting with urgency, a sense of like wondering what the outcome of this moment will be. So, and if And if you don't go to heaven, you can see what happens to the people on the lower right. So here we are up in heaven. Everyone has a halo and a seat, and it looks very comfortable. Maybe not so happy, but I think the artist is in this case kind of doing a cookie cutter face for everyone, and isn't really making his painting so much about observing real subjects, but really kind of using almost like a cartoony face for the subjects. But of course, down below in hell, you've really kind of made hell a very unattractive place. What makes hell so unattractive here visually? I hope we all agree that it's not where you want to go. And I think the idea is the artist should make it look very, yeah, gray creatures. So removing the life, like figures that have no humanity because they look like they don't have blood, like zombie figures. The suffering, yeah, obviously people are being dragged down, whipped around like rag dolls. And in the mouth of the devil, you can see him chewing the body of Judas. And the devil, you notice, do people in hell have clothing? You notice they're all naked. So, when you go to hell, you're kind of basically almost like a child, and you're reduced to kind of you lose your individuality, you lose your status, you don't have a halo. It looks almost like a Chinese dragon there down below. The way I've seen the Chinese dragons visualized on the New Year's. So maybe, who knows, maybe there's some kind of Eastern reference there. But definitely, I think you understand that hell is not a desirable place. And that, of course, is the whole point. Not only do you want to visualize how attractive heaven is, but you want to show how horrible hell is. And some people, I mean, I think it's a fair analogy that Jesus's bubble looks almost like a unfertilized egg that's like a menstruation image, perhaps, certainly using blood and kind of nudity and suffering to reinforce the idea that you don't want to go to hell. But I think the clarity here is so important because it feels like, okay, there is a sense of justice and fairness, and that sense of fairness and justice comes from the kind of organization, the harmony, the balance, and Jesus is at the center of that. So it's like going into a courtroom where everything's organized, but there's a clear sense that if you don't get a good outcome, you're going to go to a place where you really don't want to be. So remember, this is kind of the beginning of us talking about paintings and thinking about, well, of course, a painting has a lot more emotional versatility, but it's not just emotion, it's depth, it's form, it's volume, it's kind of having the inner world for the subject. So there's a lot of layers to painting beyond just kind of the visual element. There's this kind of a psychological element to it. And artists will continue to push that envelope, as we'll see in the coming weeks and months. And it all starts from this kind of painting mosaic starting point where the painting is almost emulating that kind of glorious color of mosaic that we saw, here on the far left. And things still picture the subjects still feel somewhat flat, although they are gaining some volume. You notice the colors have a lot more gradient, a lot more of a range of red, and even the blue has parts that stand out and some parts recede. And even in the backdrop, you notice above, those figures are really meant to be far away. So they're using very limited kind of foreshortening, which is a term we'll talk about later, but basically things that are farther away look much smaller, and things that are closer look much bigger. So there's a kind of tentative kind of moving towards bringing the painting to life in terms that are perhaps more photographic, if you will. Of course, that term isn't really fitting for this era because photography hasn't been invented. But from our point of view, I think you can understand that the most extreme form of naturalism is photography, and the opposite is like cartoons or like a stick figure, right? So this is somewhere in between, but the figures still don't look like very individualized except for their clothing. The background still feels very flat and a little wonky. And of course, they're not being true to ideas about scale and perspective. But as we'll see moving forward, artists start really developing painting and pushing the boundaries the same way we saw Super Mario develop into the kind of self-actualized Super Mario in contemporary Super Mario versus the version I grew up playing. So as in the coming weeks and months, I'm going to go into depth, and we're going to explore and witness how artists push the limits of painting from the starting point that you see here and here, into something that's much more like what we would expect with like a photography, like a very compelling, relatable human subject that feels like she has volume and an inner world, a background that feels like it has obeys the rules of perspective and depth, and details that feel very like the painting is alive. And once you get the background and the subject down, then you can add these layers like movement. And the movement definitely plays a big role in terms of storytelling. And it's hard to really visualize movement until you've mastered things like depth and shadows and lights and highlights and things like that. And so the next few weeks and months, we'll be looking at artists really pushing that boundary and developing painting into a much more kind of skillful, kind of almost photographic quality that you see by the time of the 1500s and the likes of Michelangelo and Caravaggio and others. So right now we're still kind of halfway between mosaic and painting, but you can see a lot of promising elements with them making figures smaller and wanting to really push the boundaries of painting. So I don't want to spend too much time, but I want to end on looking at something we'll see next week, which is, like I said at the beginning, there's a major disruption to this world of clarity that you see here and here, and maybe even in the Last Judgment, a world of clarity and order and harmony. And at least, even though there's hell, there's a very clear place for hell and a very clear, distinct place for heaven. So, and then suddenly in 1348, you get this. And so what do you think we're looking at when you look at this picture? Where do we begin? Well, who's the focal point in this picture here? And it's kind of hard to tell, like who is that figure? Who could he, she, they be? What is that thing in there in the middle? Is that the Virgin Mary, you think? It's hard to tell, right? So what do you notice is going on in the picture here? Anything you notice? Let me see if someone says a lot of death. Very good. So, in a way, if you compare this to the Last Judgment, the whole world has become kind of chaotic, like you saw, in the lower right here. So, the world succumbs to chaos, and death is a key element of that chaos. People being stabbed with spears or perhaps arrows. You notice there's a whole cross section of society on the left and right: bishops, priests, royalty. So I think the idea here is that everyone is subject to death here, not just the kind of poor, but rich and poor alike. There's no escape from COVID unless, I guess, you create a bubble or something. And then it makes you kind of wonder, well, who is this person in the middle then? And how do they relate to what's going on? And we will talk about this next week. So I'm going to leave that for something we talk about next week to just kind of give you a tease. But you might think about how color relates to this. And certainly when you work on your assignments over the weekend, really start thinking about color in terms of tone, and maybe even giving you a sense of hope and or maybe dread, depending on the picture you choose. So let me stop the recording here and just talk about the homework briefly. So yeah, so for the homework, let me put that back. For the homework, I posted over the weekend. I basically want you to pick a painting, pick a work of art that that a painting that has color. So hopefully you saw that there